December 20th, 1941. Kunming, China, 8,000 feet above sea level. The sky was winter pale, the air thin and cold, and somewhere to the south, 60 Japanese aircraft were coming to burn this city to the ground. On the airfield below, 16 American pilots sprinted toward their P-40 Tomahawks. They were not supposed to be there. Officially, every one of these men had resigned from the United States military months ago. Officially, they were employees of something called the Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company. Civilians, on paper, working for a private firm. Officially, the United States government had no knowledge of what they were doing in China. That was a lie carefully designed to survive a courtroom. These men had been recruited in secret, quietly discharged from the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps, shipped halfway around the world under false pretenses, and trained in the jungles of Burma to fight Japan, a nation with which America was officially at peace. Now, 13 days after Pearl Harbor had shattered that fiction, they were about to prove whether any of it had been worth it. The radio crackled. 10 Kawasaki Ki-48 bombers, escort fighters trailing, estimated arrival 22 minutes. In less than 90 seconds, the first P-40s were airborne. What happened next would become one of the most lopsided aerial victories of the entire Pacific War. But the story of how these men got there, how the United States secretly built a mercenary air force, armed it with cast-off fighters, hid it behind legal fictions, and then watched it do the impossible. That story begins nearly 5 years earlier, with a man the American military had tried very hard to forget. His name was Claire Chennault. And the Army Air Corps hated him. By 1937, Chennault was 47 years old, half deaf from years of open cockpit flying, and so thoroughly marginalized that his own service had made it clear he would never command anything important again. His crime was simple. He had said the generals were wrong. Throughout the 1930s, American air doctrine had crystallized around a single idea. Strategic bombing would decide the next war. Massive formations of heavy bombers, flying in tight defensive boxes, would penetrate any enemy's territory and destroy his industry until he surrendered. Fighters were obsolete. Interceptors were a waste of money. The bomber would always get through. This was not just theory. This was gospel. And Chennault had spent years publicly arguing that it was catastrophically wrong. He had developed fighter tactics based on teamwork and mutual support. The combat pairs that would later become standard everywhere. He had designed early warning systems using ground observers, radios, and coordinated plotting boards. He had written manuals, given lectures, flown demonstrations. He had proven again and again in exercises that disciplined fighter intercepts could tear bomber formations apart. The Air Corps ignored him. When he pushed harder, they sidelined him. When he kept pushing, they offered him a medical retirement. Chronic bronchitis, they said, partial deafness, unfit for continued service. In April 1937, Claire Chennault walked away from the United States military, bitter and vindicated by nothing. 3 months later, he was on a ship to China. The invitation had come through a retired Army officer named Roy Holbrook, who was working as an aviation advisor to the Chinese nationalist government. The Chinese Air Force was in ruins. Japan had invaded that summer, and Japanese bombers were annihilating every Chinese aircraft that dared to take off. Chiang Kai-shek needed help. He was willing to pay for it, and Holbrook thought Chennault might be exactly the kind of unorthodox thinker China required. Chennault arrived in Shanghai in June 1937. He was supposed to conduct a 3-month survey of Chinese air defenses. He never left. What he found appalled him. The Chinese Air Force had fewer than 100 operational combat aircraft. The pilots were poorly trained, flying against a Japanese force that outnumbered them 10-1. Spare parts were nearly impossible to obtain. Maintenance was haphazard. Communications barely existed. When Japanese bombers appeared, Chinese pilots had almost no warning. The results were predictable. In the first months of the war, China lost its air force. But Chennault saw something else. He saw that the problem was not courage. Chinese pilots fought with extraordinary bravery. The problem was doctrine, warning, and coordination. If defenders knew bombers were coming, if they had time to climb, to position, to choose their angle of attack, they could fight. And so, in the middle of a foreign war, while his own country remained officially neutral, Claire Chennault began building exactly the kind of air defense network the Army Air Corps had refused to let him test. The warning system started with peasants. Chennault recruited thousands of ground observers across China's interior: farmers, school teachers, shopkeepers, anyone who could identify aircraft and reach a telephone or radio. When Japanese formations crossed the coast, the reports began flowing. As the bombers moved inland, the network tracked them: altitude, heading, approximate numbers. By the time they approached their target, Chinese defenders could have 30 minutes or more of warning. It was crude, it was improvised, and it worked. For the first time, Chinese fighters could be airborne and waiting when the Japanese arrived. But aircraft and pilots remained the problem. China could not produce modern fighters. The Soviet Union provided some, biplanes mostly, and a handful of I-16 monoplanes, but they were never enough. By 1940, the Chinese Air Force was a shadow of itself. Chennault needed more. And in a back room in Washington, some very powerful people were starting to agree. By 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt understood something that most Americans did not want to hear. War with Japan was coming. The only question was whether China would still be fighting when it arrived. If China collapsed, Japan would control all of East Asia. It would have the resources, manpower, and industrial base to dominate the Pacific for a generation. But if China held, if Japanese armies remained bogged down in an endless land war, then Japan's options would be limited. The problem was how to help China without appearing to violate American neutrality. Congress had passed neutrality acts in the mid-30s, specifically to keep America out of foreign wars. Public opinion strongly opposed intervention. Roosevelt could not send American soldiers, American aircraft, or American weapons to a combatant nation without risking political catastrophe. But there were loopholes. And in 1940, a plan began to take shape that would exploit every one of them. The idea came from multiple sources. Chennault, certainly, but also from T.V. Soong, Chiang Kai-shek's brother-in-law and China's most influential advocate in Washington. By late 1940, they had Roosevelt's ear. By early 1941, they had his approval. The plan was audacious. Chennault would recruit American military pilots, active duty officers from the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. These pilots would resign their commissions, honorably discharged, with the secret promise that they could return to service when their contracts ended. They would sign up with a civilian company, the Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company, or CAMCO, which would officially employ them as flight instructors and aircraft assemblers. In reality, they would form a combat squadron. The aircraft would come from the British, who had ordered P-40 Tomahawks they no longer needed. The Chinese government would buy them through Lend-Lease. The pilots would be paid by CAMCO, $500 a month, with a $500 bonus for every Japanese aircraft destroyed. For the young pilots being recruited, the money was staggering. A Navy ensign made around $125 a month. A first lieutenant in the Army Air Corps made about $140. $500 plus kill bonuses was wealth beyond anything they had imagined. But the money alone does not explain why they went. The recruiters, mostly Navy officers working quietly at bases across the country, did not hide what they were asking. This was combat. This was flying against the Japanese, who had one of the best air forces in the world. This was fighting for a foreign government in an undeclared war, with no official protection and no guarantee of survival. Some of the men were adventure seekers. Some were true believers who had watched newsreels of Japanese atrocities, the bombing of Chinese cities, the massacres of civilians, the deliberate targeting of hospitals, and wanted to fight. Some were simply bored, frustrated by the endless training routines of a peacetime military that seemed to have no intention of ever letting them see action. And some had already sensed what Roosevelt knew, that war was inevitable, and that waiting for it to arrive officially was a waste of time. By the summer of 1941, Chennault had recruited 99 pilots and nearly 200 ground crew. They traveled to Asia in small groups, on different ships, by different routes, under cover stories that would not survive close examination. Dutch merchant vessels, British transports, civilian passenger liners. They arrived in Burma, officially neutral territory, and gathered at a Royal Air Force base called Toungoo. And there, in a jungle clearing with monsoon rains pounding down, Claire Chennault began to teach them how to survive. The P-40 Tomahawk was a problem disguised as an airplane. It was tough. It was fast in a dive. It had 6 .50 caliber machine guns that could shred anything they hit. But against the aircraft it would actually be fighting, the Japanese Zero. It had almost no chance in a conventional dogfight. The Zero was lighter, more maneuverable, faster in a climb. A Zero could turn inside a P-40, get on its tail, and kill it before the American pilot knew what was happening. Everything the pilots had learned about fighter combat, the twisting, turning dogfights they had practiced 1,000 times, would get them killed in seconds. Chennault knew this. He had spent years studying Japanese tactics, analyzing reports from China, interviewing the handful of pilots who had survived engagements against Japanese aircraft, and he had figured out something that changed everything. The Zero was light because it had almost no protection. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing. Its cockpit had no armor. A few rounds in the right place would turn it into a fireball. The Zero was built for offense, not survival. Its designers had traded protection for performance. The P-40, by contrast, was heavy precisely because it was built to take punishment. Armor plating behind the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, a structure that could absorb damage and keep flying. And it had one more advantage. In a dive, nothing could catch it. Chennault built his entire tactical doctrine around these facts. His pilots would not dogfight. Under no circumstances would they turn with a Zero. Instead, they would use the early warning network to get airborne early. They would climb to altitude, high above the incoming Japanese formations, and then they would dive. The attack run was simple. Dive from above and behind, build speed, fire a short burst at close range, then keep diving. Use the P-40's weight to outrun anything that tried to follow. Pull out at low altitude, climb back up, and repeat. One pass, no turning, no dogfighting, no honor. Just geometry and 6 machine guns. Chennault drilled this into them relentlessly. The pilots practiced interception timing, learning how to position themselves so they would be above the Japanese when the bombers arrived. They practiced gunnery, firing at towed targets until ammunition became too precious to waste. They memorized Japanese aircraft silhouettes until they could identify a Mitsubishi bomber from a Nakajima fighter in a fraction of a second. They learned not to chase. This was perhaps the hardest lesson. Every instinct told a fighter pilot to pursue a wounded enemy, to finish the kill. But chasing a Japanese aircraft meant slowing down, bleeding energy, becoming vulnerable. Chennault demanded discipline, hit and run, never linger, never give the enemy a stationary target. The men trained through the monsoons of late summer, through the oppressive heat of August and September, through outbreaks of dysentery and malaria that thinned their ranks. They were mechanics as well as pilots, fixing their own aircraft when parts ran out, improvising solutions that would have horrified the supply officers back home. They painted the shark mouths on their P-40s, an idea borrowed from RAF pilots in North Africa, where similar nose art had terrified Italian troops. The grinning teeth and dead eyes made the aircraft look like predators. It also gave the unit an identity, a visual signature that would soon become legendary. By early December 1941, they were as ready as they would ever be. And then, on December 7th, the world changed. The morning of December 7th, 1941, was a Sunday at Toungoo. Most of the pilots were sleeping late or nursing hangovers from Saturday night's liberty. The news arrived by radio. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. The Pacific Fleet was in ruins. Thousands of Americans were dead. The Philippines were under assault. Wake Island was being bombed. Hong Kong was falling. War had arrived. But for the American volunteer group, nothing changed, except that the legal fiction no longer mattered. They had been preparing to fight a secret war. Now they would fight an official one. The mission was the same. Defend the Burma Road, protect Kunming, destroy Japanese aircraft. Everything else was paperwork. On December 12th, the AVG flew its first combat mission, not over China, but over Thailand, where Japanese forces were massing for the invasion of Burma. It was a reconnaissance flight, and it found nothing. On December 20th, they found everything. The Japanese formations appeared from the south, 10 Kawasaki Ki-48 bombers, with an escort of fighters trailing behind. They were heading for Kunming, the main supply hub for the Burma Road, intending to reduce it to rubble the way they had reduced Chongqing at Nanking and a dozen other Chinese cities. The warning network had picked them up almost an hour out. By the time the Japanese crossed into Chinese airspace, 16 P-40s were already airborne, climbing in the thin mountain air toward 20,000 feet. The pilots who flew that day had trained for this moment for months. They had memorized Chennault's rules. They had practiced the diving attack until it was automatic. But none of them had ever fired at an aircraft that was trying to kill them. They found the Japanese formation just south of the city. The bombers were at about 16,000 feet, flying in a tight defensive box. The escorts, Ki-27 fighters, older but still dangerous, were weaving above and behind. The P-40S had altitude advantage. Everything depended on using it. The first flight dove. 4 aircraft, throttles wide open, airspeed building past 350 miles per hour. The lead pilot, Robert Duke Hedman, aimed for the bomber formation, holding fire until he was close enough to see the rivets on the Japanese fuselage. At 200 yards, he squeezed the trigger. 6 .50 caliber guns erupted. The tracers reached out like white rope. The bomber in his sights shuddered, then began to trail smoke. Hedman kept diving. He did not watch to see if it fell. That was not the doctrine. Hit and run. Behind him, 3 more P-40S flashed through the formation, guns blazing. The Japanese bomber stream began to come apart. Damaged aircraft dropped out of formation. Escorts dove after the attacking P-40S, trying to catch them, but the Americans were already below, pulling out at low altitude, building speed to climb back up. The second flight hit them 60 seconds later. Then the third. The engagement lasted perhaps 20 minutes. When it was over, the skies above Kunming were empty, except for falling wreckage and scattered parachutes. The AVG had destroyed 6 bombers outright. 3 more were so badly damaged they crashed before reaching their bases. At least 2 escort fighters had been shot down. The Americans had lost 1 aircraft. The pilot bailed out and walked back to base. 6-1 on their first real combat mission. The ratio would only improve. 2 days later, on December 23rd, the Japanese came again, this time with more bombers and more fighters. The AVG scrambled from Kunming, still exhausted from the previous engagement, running low on ammunition, patching aircraft with whatever materials they could find. It did not matter. The pilots dove through the formation exactly as Chennault had taught them. They hit, They ran. They climbed and hit again. This time, the Japanese lost 8 bombers and 4 fighters. The AVG lost 2 aircraft, 1 pilot killed, 1 safely bailed out. 4-1, with exhausted pilots and improvised repairs. By Christmas Day 1941, the Japanese had abandoned their attempt to bomb Kunming into submission. The price was simply too high. In 4 days of combat, the American volunteer group had shot down more Japanese aircraft than the entire Chinese Air Force had destroyed in 6 months. And the legend of the Flying Tigers was born. The name came from the press. A journalist, some say it was a wire service reporter in Rangoon, others credit different sources, called them the Flying Tigers, and the name stuck. It captured the ferocity, the exotic locale, the improbability of American pilots fighting in China before America had even entered the war. The shark-mouthed P-40 became one of the most famous images of the Second World War. But the legend obscured a grimmer reality. The AVG was not just defending Kunming. They were defending the Burma Road. And the Burma Road was the only thing keeping China alive. By December 1941, nearly all of China's industrial base had been lost. The ports were in Japanese hands. The railroads were cut. The only way to supply the nationalist government, the only way to deliver fuel, ammunition, medicine, trucks, machinery, everything a modern army needed to keep fighting, was a narrow, winding, 1,500-mile road that climbed from Rangoon through the jungle mountains of Burma to Kunming. If the Japanese could cut that road, China would be strangled. The war would effectively be over. And in late December, as the AVG was fighting for its life over Kunming, the Japanese were already moving to cut the road at its source. The invasion of Burma began January 20th, 1942. Japanese forces crossed from Thailand into southern Burma with overwhelming strength. The British colonial garrison, poorly equipped, badly led, demoralized by defeats in Malaya and Singapore, collapsed almost immediately. Within weeks, the Japanese had taken Moulmein, the key crossing point on the Salween River. By February, they were advancing on Rangoon, the capital and the primary port, through which all Burma Road supplies passed. The AVG was now fighting on 2 fronts. Half the unit remained in Kunming, defending China. The other half deployed to Rangoon, trying to buy time for the British to organize a defense. The Rangoon battles were some of the most intense of the AVG's existence. On January 23rd, Japanese bombers hit the city in a massive raid, over 70 aircraft, the largest formation the AVG had yet faced. The Americans scrambled with everything they had. 21 P-40s against more than 30 fighters and 40 bombers. The tactics held. Dive from altitude. Hit the bombers. Do not turn. Do not chase. Build speed and climb to hit again. That day, the AVG claimed 15 Japanese aircraft destroyed. The actual number may have been lower. Aerial combat claims were always inflated by the chaos of battle. But the effect was undeniable. The Japanese formation scattered. Bombs fell wildly. The precision strike became a chaotic retreat. The AVG lost 3 pilots killed and several aircraft damaged beyond repair. It was a victory, but it was also a warning. The math was brutal. The AVG had started with 99 pilots and roughly 80 aircraft. Every loss was irreplaceable. There were no reinforcements. There was no resupply pipeline. Every bullet, every gallon of fuel, every spare part came from whatever stocks had been accumulated before the war began. At Rangoon's pace, the unit would cease to exist within weeks. Chennault understood this. He rotated his pilots ruthlessly, pulling exhausted men off the line before they made fatal mistakes, husbanding his aircraft with miserly discipline. He refused to commit to battles he could not win. He accepted that some targets would not be defended, because defending them would cost too many aircraft. It was not heroic. It was mathematics. And it was the only reason the AVG survived. But even by late February 1942, the city was falling. British forces were retreating north. The docks were being demolished to deny them to the Japanese. The last supply ships were unloading frantically, trying to move their cargo up the road before the enemy arrived. They destroyed their airfield at Mingaladon before they left, burned the hangars, wrecked the irreplaceable equipment that could not be moved. Then they flew north to Magwe, then to Lashio, then finally to Kunming, each retreat buying time, each airfield abandoned before the Japanese could catch them on the ground. By March 1942, the AVG was back in China. The Burma Road was cut. Everything they had fought for, the convoys, the supply dumps, the grinding work of keeping China connected to the outside world, was gone. But they were still alive. And as long as they were alive, they could still fight. The spring of 1942 was the darkest period for the Allied cause in Asia. Singapore had fallen. The Dutch East Indies were gone. The Philippines were collapsing. The Imperial Japanese Navy dominated the Pacific from India to Hawaii. Every day brought news of another defeat, another retreat, another catastrophe. And in the middle of it, a handful of American mercenaries flying obsolete aircraft from a Chinese backwater kept shooting down Japanese bombers. The AVG's kill ratio during this period was almost unbelievable. Between December 1941 and July 1942, the unit claimed 297 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Post-war analysis, using Japanese records, confirmed at least 99 aerial victories, with the actual number likely higher, since many Japanese losses were recorded as failed to return, without specifying cause. The AVG's own losses in aerial combat were 12 aircraft. 12 against 99, 8-1. No other fighter unit in any theater of the Second World War achieved comparable results. But the numbers obscure the human cost. The AVG lost 22 men during its 7 months of existence. Some died in combat. Some died in accidents, the price of flying damaged aircraft from primitive airfields in bad weather. Some died of disease, malaria, and dysentery, claiming men that Japanese fighters could not touch. In a unit of less than 100 pilots, every death was personal. And there was no recognition coming. These men were not soldiers. They were civilians. They had no military rank, no military benefits, no military protection. If captured, they could be executed as mercenaries. Their families received no government support. Their service would not count toward military pensions. They were fighting for a country that officially did not know they existed. Some of them were bitter about this. Some made dark jokes. Some simply did not care. They had come to fight, and fighting was what they were doing. But as 1942 progressed, another problem emerged. America was finally in the war. And America wanted its pilots back. The Pentagon had always viewed the AVG as a temporary expedient, a stopgap born from the desperate months before Pearl Harbor. Now that America was officially fighting, the military wanted the AVG absorbed into the regular command structure. The pilots would become Army officers again. The unit would fall under conventional military authority. Chennault resisted. He fought for his pilots' bonuses, their contracts, their independence. He argued that the AVG's success depended on its unorthodox methods, methods that would be strangled by regular military bureaucracy. He warned that forcing the pilots to choose between re-enlistment and going home would destroy the unit's cohesion. He lost. On July 4, 1942, the American Volunteer Group was officially disbanded. The pilots were offered a chance to join the newly formed 23rd Fighter Group at regular Army pay, under regular Army command, with none of the bonuses they had been promised. Most of them went home instead. Of the surviving AVG pilots, only 5 accepted induction into the 23rd. The rest took their money, their memories, and their legends and scattered back to America. The Flying Tigers had ceased to exist. But what they had proven could not be unlearned. Chennault's tactics, the diving attacks, the early warning networks, the disciplined refusal to dogfight superior aircraft, became standard doctrine across the Pacific theater. The pilots who had developed these methods under fire went on to train hundreds of other aviators. The lessons written in blood over Kunming and Rangoon saved lives at Midway, Guadalcanal, and 100 other battles. And the legend grew. The shark-mouthed P-40 became an icon. Artists painted it on posters. Journalists wrote breathless profiles. Hollywood made movies. The Flying Tiger name was borrowed by airlines, sports teams, and 1,000 small businesses wanting to associate themselves with that desperate, glamorous, impossible success. But these men succeeded because they were willing to break every rule. They were mercenaries fighting for a foreign government, while their own country was officially at peace. They were recruited through deception, paid under the table, covered by legal fictions that would have collapsed under any serious scrutiny. Their entire existence violated the neutrality acts that Congress had passed specifically to prevent this kind of involvement. And the Roosevelt administration sent them anyway. Because Roosevelt understood what most Americans did not yet accept. The war was already here. Pretending otherwise was not neutrality. It was denial. The attack on Pearl Harbor did not start the war. It merely ended the pretense. By December 1941, Japan had been fighting in China for over 4 years. America had been providing aid to China through back channels for nearly as long. The oil embargo was strangling Japanese industry. The diplomatic negotiations were going nowhere. Everyone who understood the strategic picture knew that war was coming. Roosevelt sent the Flying Tigers because he refused to wait for the inevitable. And when the cables came from Kunming, 6 bombers destroyed, 1 aircraft lost, ratio holding at better than 5-to-1, he knew something that the generals back home had refused to believe. Claire Chennault had been right. The bombers could be stopped. The fighters were not obsolete. And men the military establishment had ignored had just proven it with blood. There is one photograph from 1942 that captures the whole strange contradiction of the Flying Tigers. A group of AVG pilots stand in front of their shark-faced P-40s. They wear leather jackets and sunglasses. Some are grinning. Some squint against the sun. They look like movie stars, which, in a sense, they were becoming. None of them wears an American uniform. Look closer. The aircraft behind them carry no American insignia, only the white sun of nationalist China and the painted teeth of a predator. These planes officially belong to a foreign air force. These pilots officially do not exist. They are fighting for a country that will not claim them. They are dying for a cause their government publicly ignores. And they are winning battles that seemed impossible because a half-deaf retiree refused to accept that the experts knew better than he did. That is the heart of the Flying Tigers story. Not just courage, not just skill, but the stubborn, inconvenient truth that expertise can be wrong, that the men in the field sometimes understand reality better than the men in the offices, that 100 volunteers, properly trained and properly led, can accomplish what the established order said was impossible. 99 confirmed victories. 12 losses in aerial combat. 7 months. 1 road kept open until the mathematics of global war finally overwhelmed it. 1 legend built from legal fictions, desperate improvisation, and the willingness to fight. After the war, the survivors scattered. Some returned to military service and flew in other theaters. Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, later famous for commanding the Black Sheep Squadron in the Pacific, had been an AVG pilot first. David Lee "Tex" Hill became an ace several times over. Others left aviation entirely, returning to farms and factories and small towns, their Flying Tiger service becoming a story they told at bars and reunions. Chennault stayed in China until the end of the war, commanding the 14th Air Force, still fighting the same bureaucratic battles against his own military that he had fought in the 1930s. He never stopped believing that his methods were right. The establishment never stopped trying to prove him wrong. History sided with Chennault. The tactics he developed, the coordinated interception, the early warning systems, the disciplined hit-and-run attacks, became the foundation of American fighter doctrine. But by then, the Flying Tigers themselves were fading into myth. Today, Most of the P-40s they flew are gone. A few survive in museums, restored, repainted, their shark mouths gleaming under fluorescent lights. Visitors photograph them without understanding what they represent. These aircraft were not great warplanes. They were compromised machines, outclassed by their opponents, flown by men who had been kicked out of their military and shipped to a jungle on the far side of the world. They should have been slaughtered. Instead, they became legend. Because the men who flew them understood something that the doctrine manuals missed. War is not about the best equipment. It is not about the most advanced technology. It is about finding the advantage you have, whatever it is, and exploiting it ruthlessly before the enemy can adapt. The P-40 could dive, so they dove. The Japanese Zero had no armor, so they shot for the fuel tanks. The warning network could give them altitude, so they climbed and waited. Simple, brutal, effective. 8-1. If you had never heard this story, if you had never known that American pilots fought Japan before Pearl Harbor, under fake identities, for a country that pretended not to notice, then understand this. There are hundreds of stories like this one. Forgotten missions, overlooked squadrons, men and women who changed history and then vanished from the textbooks because their sacrifices did not fit the official narrative. Every week, this channel finds them. Subscribe. Because someone should remember the ones who fought before anyone admitted there was a war.